All right, so let's look from left to right, and we're looking at the geography first. Geography. All right, and it's asking you mountains, rivers. I'll go over more in depth this stuff, but just put it in here for now. Mountains, rivers, weather patterns, agriculture, physical barriers, etc. Proximity to the ocean. So Mesopotamia, you have the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia is basically the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the land between two rivers. It's located in the Fertile Crescent, that fertile arc of land that's sort of shaped, like a moon, like a half moon or a crescent, where you have extremely fertile land. All right. The geography, and we'll go more into details, very flat land and all that good stuff we'll talk about when we look at the notes. Egypt, you have the Nile, located on the Nile, about 750-mile stretch of the Nile. Located also beside the Red Sea, which is great for trade eventually. The Nile River Delta empties into the Mediterranean. You have a black dirt soil produced by flooding of the Nile. India is missing a little bit something here, but you have the Indus River Valley. That's where Indian civilization began. The Ganges, which is the most sacred river in India. You have the two mountains and the Indian Ocean that protect India. So you got the Himalayas that separate China and India. You've got the Hindu Kush. The Hindu Kush is where it does protect from invasion, but eventually invaders come through the north, the Aryans, and they wind up bringing the caste system and all that good stuff. So the Hindu Kush, and then you want to put in there Indian Ocean. These were the three, sort of natural barriers that protected India. In China, you've got the Yellow River, but you want to also known as the Huanghe River. The Gobi Desert to the north, and of course the Himalayan mountains to the southwest, which separate it from India. All right, religions. Mesopotamia, polytheistic religion. They built ziggurats, were like temples. You had festivals. In Mesopotamian society, remember, priests were at the highest sort of, social structure. They were important. Egyptians, also polytheistic, theocracy, where the pharaoh was your god. He was also the king. They built temples, aka pyramids. They practiced mummification or preservation of the dead. And the way they preserved them was through a mummification process. We'll look at that as well. They believed in the afterlife and that the stuff you had was important to you in your afterlife. Indian culture, I don't like the polytheistic and the Brahmanism. Remember that Hindus were monistic, and we'll look at that a little bit more when we talk about them. And Buddhists, most Buddhists don't believe as Buddha as a god or believe in gods. China, you had ancestral worship, worship of ancestors. You had the philosophy of Confucianism that we'll talk more about. Confucianism, respect for elders, filial piety, emphasis on education, etc. You had Taoism. Taoism was, sort of like nature worship or respect for nature, living a simple life. A lot of peasants like this. Okay. And then we really didn't talk about the legalism and you know, sort of harsh word, kind of political. All right, politics for the Sumerians. Politics, warrior kings, which led to dynasties, which led to empires. You had law codes. You had first the Hebrews with the Ten Commandments. Well, not first. Let me rephrase that. First law code was Hammurabi's code, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You know, then you had the Hebrews who had the Ten Commandments, an ethical code. You had forms of bureaucracy or government, you know, jobs, government sort of, you know, people who were running certain aspects of the government. Politics for the Egyptians, the pharaoh was the king. He was also the, you know, considered a god. The viziers advised him. They had a theocracy where your, you know, your government leader is also your religious leader. So your political leader and your religious leader are the same guy. They believed the pharaoh was a god. He was also the king. And you had dynasties in which, you know, rule was passed on through hereditary means. So if you were the father, you would pass on your kingdom to your son. When you look at the Hindus, small kingdoms, they, you know, had clans, groups of people. Theirs we don't really cover as much when we talk about politics. We'll look a little bit at some of that stuff, elections. When you think about China, you think about the emperors, the dynasties, the dynastic cycle, the mandate of heaven, where, you know, God chose the person to rule. You had feudal societies in some cases, and you had legalism. Legalism is a harsh sort of a political thing where you punish people who break laws, you know, harsh punishments. Emphasis on, you know, I guess what you would say, emphasis on law and order. Social patterns, you have, you know, when we talk about these societies, who's in charge? You had a king. For the Mesopotamians, you had kings, nobles. You had people who specialized in certain jobs like merchants. So if you're writing about this, you could probably say, hey, you know, my father is a basket weaver, and so I'm learning how to do that. I would fall in this merchant class. You had servants, and you did have slaves. Slavery not based on race. With Mesopotamia, there's a video I'm going to post, and the video is really good. It's a little girl. She's basically doing what you're going to do in the assignment. She talks about how, you know, the gods they worship, and the, you know, her uncle does this, her brother does this. She's a scribe, which wouldn't be realistic, but, you know, a person who reads or writes. For the Egyptians, you had kings or pharaohs, you had nobility, merchants, and then you had slaves. The pharaoh is the god king. He is considered a god, and he's considered a king as well. India, you have the caste system. You remember the Brahmins, the untouchables who were outside the caste. You had your Sudras, your Kshatriyas, which are your warriors. Chinese, you had peasant farmers. They also created the civil service system, which is real important. So just like if you want to work at the post office today, you got to take a civil service exam. This gave jobs to people who were qualified instead of people's buddies. Now, if I do move quickly, you can watch this over. I will video in this, and you can watch it over, and you can do a lot of things. This is probably the last grade you'll get, like grade. So make sure you keep up with all the things that you need to do. All right, you guys got any questions about this chart? If you missed any of it, okay, if you're missing any of it, you can go back and watch the video. So what I'm going to do, what's that?
Hey, Mr. Asbury. So from my graphic organizer, I did it in Google Docs, and I just shared the Google Doc with you. Is that fine?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
All right, so what we're going to go over first is going to be Mesopotamia. Because of the agricultural transition, if you look and what you're going to, if you choose Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, you know that it's located between the Tigris and Euphrates. The world's earliest cities developed and prospered here. Mesopotamian prosperity and sophisticated culture attracted many migrants and influenced many neighbors, including the Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Indo-Europeans. Some of the characteristics of these societies: establishment of government institutions to provide order and stability. These institutions evolved into hereditary kingships and at times into empires when states sought to expand their dominion into neighboring lands. The emergence of social classes as the result of specialization. So you had people who did other things than just grow food. And you start seeing trade, you see bartering, things like that. Agricultural surplus and the accompanying specialization allowed individuals and groups to produce goods of high quality. The desire for these goods in turn helped stimulate trade with other societies. Distinct cultural traditions that developed, including a system of writing that would endure for thousands of years. It's one thing that you don't have on your chart that you do need to know, the first form of writing, cuneiform, developed here. Sumerians, there you see the ziggurat. Remember, they're located in the Fertile Crescent, the half-moon shaped area of rich soil running from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. When you look at the map, it gives you a better idea here of how far it stretches. So here's Mesopotamia in this area, and the Fertile Crescent stretches out all the way to Egypt. But the reason they call it the Fertile Crescent, sort of a half-moon shape, area of extremely fertile land, the Tigris and Euphrates in between there. Mesopotamia is called the land between two rivers. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates. Here you would see it in this area right here. Sumeria is located down here when we talk about that. Both rivers overflowed, flooding was very unpredictable. Here's something that you look at when you talk about geography. The flooding is interesting to me because it helps, you know. It's the reason you have fertile soil, but it's also unpredictable. It could come between March and the end of June. Just think about the flooding around here, you know. If flooding isn't a good thing, it ruins people's businesses. In a lot of cases, you know, roads are washed out, people are washed out. You know, bad things could happen, especially back then. They did have irrigation systems. They built canals and dikes to bring water to their fields. You know, one thing you could also do is say, hey, you know, we had a field, I built an irrigation system, I dug it out, and so I could get water to come from the river to my crops. Okay. Mesopotamia consisted of low, you know, relatively low plains. You see real flat land here. It was not isolated. Tribes often invaded and conquered it and established empires. Attacks by others led to wall building and military development. By 3000 BC, the Sumerians had settled in the southeastern part of Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf. All right, city-states, that's one of the form of government that you had, ruled by a king or priest. So the city and the surrounding area, the city-state. All right, it would be like a city-state here would be like Martinsville, and then Henry County surrounds it. Danville, Pittsylvania County surrounds it. So the city and the area around it. You're going to watch that video on your own. It's very good. And if I have time, I'll show it to you tomorrow. But it's the little girl telling you all about basically doing the assignment that you're going to do. Cities often fought over land boundaries and water rights. These civil wars weakened them, allowing easier conquest. Here is your social classes and how it was divided. You had kings, priests, and nobility at the top. Nobility, you know, landowners. You had the merchants who were, you know, they built things, they made things, they sold things, different sort of things, however you want to look at it, pottery. In some cases, they might make armor. And you had smart people who were scholars, you know, along with the merchants. Then you had peasant farmers, usually pretty poor. And then slavery. Slavery not based on race. It was based on, you know, if a person had been conquered, captured in war, they became slaves. Most Sumerians were farmers. Dates, grains, vegetables, animals, and flax seeds. Since there was a surplus of food, people became artisans and traders. One of the main things that artisans and these people would produce were clay bricks. That's a clay brick. They would form this. I think the little girl talks about this too, but they would, you know, basically it would be mud and they would shape it into this and it would turn real hard when the sun came out and baked it up. Sumerians were polytheistic. The gods were identified with forces of nature and heavenly bodies. Individual cities adopted a god, and life after death was a short, shadowy existence. There was like no heaven or hell. It was just, this is where you go when you die. No reward, no punishment. Now, the reason I'm going over these two is these are things you can use to write your on your project. This is what you would write about. You know, this god Enlil, when you watch the video of the little girl, she says Enlil is the god of this, and this is our, you know, the god of our city, blah blah blah. Ziggurats, temples made of baked brick, placed in layers and shaped like step pyramids. There, you see that? Written language, this is one thing that's not on your chart, but it's real important. Oldest known writing system, cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing. Writing was done on clay tablets like this right here. They used this. I always think about my son's DS lights. You know, they got a stylus, a wooden tool used for writing. It developed from these pictographs. And you can see the evolution where it starts as a picture. You see the foot, and then it winds up in this wedge-shaped writing. You see it? Education was limited. In the video, the girl is a scribe. She could not really have been a scribe because only boys received an education. Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest known literary works. She tells you all about that. They developed a number system. Don't pay attention to that algebra because, you know, it's a form of algebra. It's not what you consider algebra like you guys take. Lunar calendar. It's believed they developed the wheel and the arch. All right, now we're going to look at the Egyptians. Welcome to ancient Egypt. Remember, without the Nile River, Egypt is nothing. Herodotus calls Egypt the gift of the Nile. The Sahara region used to be grassy with water, but now it's mostly a desert, the Sahara Desert. Climates became hotter and drier after 5000 BCE. People were driven to the Nile. So this is why people went to the Nile to grow food. Without the Nile River, the land could not have supported the great civilization that appeared here. So the characteristics. When you're thinking about the geography, remember the Nile is the longest river in the world, 4,160 miles that flows from south to north. It branches into the Nile Delta and empties into the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptians built their civilization along this 750-mile stretch of the Nile. Egyptian farmers planned their work around the summer floods, and they harvested crops before the floods came. That's something you could write about, definitely, right there. The waters receded, the fertile soil was left behind. So flooding leaves the fertile soil. Short canals, and what you would look at is irrigation. They had irrigation systems, could grow 2 to 3 crops a year, because you had a frost-free environment. There was no, you didn't have to worry about there being a winter or cold. All right, frost-free climate made it easy to grow many kinds of crops and have 2 to 3 crops a year. The flooding allowed you to have fertile soil all the time, so you didn't have to do things like crop rotation or slash and burn. Boats can travel upstream. You could talk about that. The Nile contains granite, and this is what a lot of your pyramids and stuff like that, granite, sandstone, limestone, was used to build those things, the pyramids. Nile limestone. The deserts and seas provided a natural protection against invaders. The Isthmus of Suez, a land bridge between Africa and Asia, provided the route for trade. And then you see the Red Sea over here also could be used, Red Sea trade. Steps towards civilization, hunter-gatherers moved there. They discovered how to make bronze. They learned how to glaze pottery, which led to specialization. Hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics, something you really need to know. This is their form of writing, something you could write about in your, your paragraph. They use more than 600 signs, pictures, or symbols to represent words and sounds. Carving them was difficult. They used papyrus for writing, made from a reed grown along the Nile. It's not really paper. Okay, we will talk about paper later, but this is what they use to write on, papyrus. Something you could be like, as I'm writing this today, I'm writing on my papyrus, used for writing. You won't talk about the Rosetta Stone, but this is how we learned to decipher Hieroglyphics on the stone were passages written in Greek, hieroglyphics, and Egyptian. We use the Greek to decode the hieroglyphics. Kingdoms you don't have to worry about as much. You do need to know that the pharaohs were gods. They were kings and gods. Okay, you could talk about some of this. This is one thing that's really important. The dynastic rule means, dynasty means the right to rule passes on within the family. So if you are the king, your son takes over, and if your son ain't around, in some cases the daughter, but yes, the son takes over and becomes the pharaoh. People regarded the pharaohs as gods. They built temples and tombs to honor them, aka the pyramids. And later rulers took the title of pharaoh, meaning great house, something you would definitely write about. Historians divided the time period from Menes into 3 kingdoms. Just know this, you don't have to know about the kingdoms as much. Do know that the pyramids at Giza are tombs for royalty. You could write about that, say that I was looking out at the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx. Lower classes included peasants and farmers. They also served in the army and worked on building projects. Upper class included the pharaoh, the royal family, priests, scribes, and government officials. You do need to know these social classes, really. And you would write about this. What would I be in? Would I be a priest? Would I be a scribe? Would I be a government official? Would I be the pharaoh? You know, you can write it in those kind of ways. So we're going to look at, you don't have to know about the Hyksos. We'll look at, you know, some of the pharaohs. You could even put, you know, Hatshepsut is our pharaoh. We did this. Hatshepsut is the first or earliest known female ruler. There she is today. That's our mummy. We'll talk about mummy here in a minute. Mummification. Thutmose. There's Thutmose today. Look at me smiling. That's great. Egyptians were polytheistic, belief in many gods. King Tut, probably one of the more famous mummies that we have discovered, really helped us learn about Egyptian life and culture. And then you have Ramses. There's Ramses. Look at his hair right there. That's awesome, right? All right. So let's look a little bit at Egyptian life and culture, and then we'll be done with Egypt. So the Egyptians built pyramids as tombs for the pharaohs, something you could write about. The Great Pyramid in Giza, Khufu, is the largest pyramid. It's about 13 acres, was about 480 feet high, more than 2 million blocks of stone. Engineers built ramps and levers. I don't believe any of this, but thousands of workers moved the heavy stones. I don't agree with this, but there is a belief that the slaves built the pyramids. Slave labor isn't very good, so we'll, you know, I don't know. The Egyptians realized a bright star appeared above the horizon right before the Nile flooded. The time between one horizon of the star and the next was 365 days, 365-day calendar. 12 months, 30 days each. The remaining days were used for holidays and feasting. They used a number system. They used geometry to build the pyramids, even though it wasn't called geometry back then. All right, so education. Scribes were clerks who learned to read and write so they could work for the government. Schools were attached to temples. Villages had their own local god or gods. These gods often had animal symbols. Sacred animals included the cat, the bull, the crocodile, the scarab beetle. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. The Egyptians were polytheistic. All right, here's one of the gods you could write about. Amun-Re, the chief god, the creator, identified with the sun, like the sun god. Osiris was the first mummy. The god of the underworld judged people after death with the feather of truth. Some of the cult, you know, when you think about the story of Osiris, brother Seth murders Osiris and scatters his body. Wife Isis, you've heard that word before, gathers him up. The gods restore him to life in the underworld, becomes associated with the Nile, growing the crops, life and death, and immortality. Osiris judges the heart of the dead against the feather of truth. Isis is the goddess of the royal throne and the household arts. Hathor is the goddess of love, music, dance, cow, horns, sun disk on the head there. Semet is the goddess of the sun woman with the lion's head. Horus is the son of Osiris, a hawk or a man with a hawk's head covered with the crown of all of Egypt. Anubis is the god of embalming. So a lot of times when preparing mummies, they would wear this head of the jackal. Egyptians believed in an afterlife. The body had to be preserved to make life after death possible, which led to this: mummification. Organs were removed from the body, which was treated with chemicals. This preserved the body for centuries. There you see an Egyptian doctor. Mummification was used to preserve the body so that their soul would recognize it when they stood outside of it. The Ka is the soul. Mummies were buried with clothes, food, tools, weapons, and other items. Something, once again, you could write about. You know, the Pharaoh dies, I helped bury him with all his stuff. Remember that in ancient Egyptian society too, a lot of times the mummy, the dead mummy was buried with, you know, the people who assisted them, like their slaves. A lot of the slaves were in there. Remember that video I showed you of how the guy was like, oh yeah, you've got to go. You were the Pharaoh's main bum wiper. So the pharaohs had people who would actually wipe their butts for them. They would often be left in there alive with the pharaoh. At first, only pharaohs were mummified, and later on, everyone, you know, had the ability to do it. But you know, usually the ruling class and wealthy could afford it. Eventually, commoners would do it. A little humor there. So, you know, making a mummy, I'm not going to go over all this. You can see this is something you could write about too. But, you know, making a mummy was very complex. The Book of the Dead, scrolls that were placed in the tomb to serve as a guide for you in the afterlife. I'm not going to go over all this as well. Just know the Book of the Dead is something, once again, that existed. Lower classes would never enter the rank of the upper class. Women did enjoy many legal rights. Egyptian women could own property. Wheat and barley were the main crops of the Egyptians. This is why they're called the bread basket of the world. You use that wheat to make bread. Flax was used to make a linen cloth. Egyptians used cotton for clothes, grew cotton. You see some of the Egyptian clothing there. Peasants could keep just part of the crop. The rest went to the pharaoh. Pharaoh got it. So you could write about that, taxing. You know, the pharaoh I would keep a little bit and I had to give the rest to the pharaoh. Trade was controlled by the government. Egyptians traded the extra food with other people. Egyptians would often, you know, have people like the Romans and the Greeks control them because of this, you know, being the bread basket of the world, being able to grow a surplus. Surplus meaning they grew extra food. Merchants rode donkeys. Surplus food allowed the possibility to trade. Reminder, they could grow 3 crops a year. So, you know, your first crop would feed your people, but the other 2 could feed all sorts of other, you know, groups of people. All right, there you see some of the trade routes, which are going to be important a little bit later on. They formed caravans, people traveling for safety over long distances to trade. Egyptians built seagoing ships. All right, and so basically I know I went over it very quickly, but hopefully, you know, hopefully it'll help you. I only got one person left in here. That's wonderful.